So, Rich, the State of FinOps survey revealed that one of the biggest challenge FinOps practitioners were having was getting engineers to take action. What's your own personal experience in that?
So the first thing is, I think what's really, really critical here are the soft skills, the soft interpersonal skills that a FinOps team employs to do that. So to back up a little bit, the way we think about the right way to assemble a FinOps team is to have sort of timeshares of people from other roles in the org. And sometimes, as you know, we have one or two people in many large enterprises that have full-time FinOps practitioners, but usually there are other folks on the team that sort of donate part of their week to doing this work. And so with that as a backdrop of what we're talking about is who's going to engage with the engineers. That's kind of when I speak about the FinOps org. That's kind of how I view them being assembled. And so the first thing that we talk about with this is have a pretty good mix of people on that team. I've seen FinOps practitioners when they were full-time having been pulled from the technical side, and then they learn the finance work there. And I'll get back in a moment why that's important. Other times I've seen it where they're more on the finance side as far as their backgrounds. The reason it's interesting to have diverse backgrounds on the FinOps team professionally is having at least one FinOps practitioner who comes from the technical side is so vital, because that he or she will be able to sort of translate the way the engineers think to the way that the finance people think. There are other benefits to that as well, among them that, again, they're going to have a really good perspective on kind of what is the art of the possible. So for example, if the tooling makes recommendations like right sizing or terminating, having somebody technical in the FinOps team, they're going to be able to translate that a little bit and say, well, hold on, there's a nuance here. The tooling doesn't understand how this technology works or how we're applying it. So I would say the first thing is when you assemble the team is make sure that there is somebody from the technical world on the team, because that person's going to be more able to translate to the non-technical folks, and B, he or she probably already has relationships with other engineers. And that can go a long way, because now they know they're speaking with somebody that has their same background. So that's kind of the first part, is how you comprise the team and have somebody technical, at least one or two people technical on there. The second thing is the soft interpersonal skills are enormously important. So when we look at how you instantiate a FinOps team, one of the things that I tell clients is it matters very much how that team is presented to the org. And I'll couch that in terms of what does not work well, and then couch it in terms of what does. So what does not work well is if the FinOps team is positioned as sort of a traffic cop or a hall monitor or somebody that's there to enforce. The reality is that these teams rarely have formal power in the organization. It may be the case that management might intervene and say, we have a mandate to reduce cost by 20% or something like that. But there, the power, if you will, lies with that mandate in management. And rarely is it the case that FinOps practitioners can, in air quotes, make anybody do anything.
Have you seen examples where organizations have got that wrong, and the FinOps team has been promoted to the organization as some sort of policeman?
I have not seen it formally done, but I have seen FinOps practitioners presume that they have that power, and I've watched how poisonous that is, right? Because they don't. The reality is they don't. So the answer to your question is no. I haven't seen them formally been given the power to say, no, you're going to terminate these instances, or you're going to do something. I haven't seen that done, but I've seen them behave as though that were the case, and it becomes very poisonous. So let's take the opposite extreme of what works well. When the FinOps team is instantiated, what you want is to promote the view that they're there to help the other teams, that they are a resource to help the technical teams. And as part of that, they're a resource, for example, to help with improve reporting. They're there as a resource to help improve the visibility that the engineering teams have into what their spend is. and they're there to help provide guidance on how teams might save. So setting it up that way, positioning the team that way is much more constructive, because now, particularly if there is a management mandate, for example, find 20% cost savings by time X, if you, when the FinOps team then approaches the technical teams, they're suddenly going to be seen as an ally helping that technical team meet the mandate, right? As opposed to a nag or irritant or somebody, second guessing the architectures of the technical team. So that's the second thing. So the first was, how do you comprise the team? Let's make sure engineering is represented. Let's make sure we have at least one practitioner on the FinOps team that comes from the engineering side. The second thing is how you position the org, and that is that they're a resource to help teams. They're there to help. The third thing then is building relationships. So what I've seen works really well is long before the FinOps team approaches technical teams with a request or a recommendation or anything, build relationships first. And the way it works is you start by segmenting the spend, which is something we want all FinOps teams to do, in a way that you can hopefully trace every dollar of spend to a responsible party. And in the best context there, you have a financial RP who is responsible for the spend, and you have a technical RP, who's the person who actually instantiates the workloads, designs the architectures, and so on. Sometimes those are the same human, but they're distinct notions, and many times they're not the same human. So you start there, you segment it, you name the RPs, and then what we want to see is that the FinOps practitioners build relationships with them ahead of time. Hey, jump on a call with us. Here's who we are. Here's what we're doing. Here's why we may come and approach you. And when those relationships are there and you have a high level of trust, then when you come to them with some kind of ask, the whole rapport is much more positive, because there's already a relationship there. They know who you are. It's not coming over the transom. I think one of the worst things you can do is sort of, in air quotes, blindside a technical team. And I'll tell a story here of how this can go wrong. Fortunately, I was not the practitioner involved in this, but it was very, frankly, it was very early in my days as a practitioner. But when I was at Cloudability, we were really starting to set up these services from scratch. And I watched a consultant at Cloudability approach a large financial client that we had. It was a very, very important client. It was actually our first services client. And we were doing the normal things. We're starting to help them look at how to report. We're starting to help them look at efficiency. And they went on site to the client, the Cloudability practitioner did, and they came with a right sizing report. And they started to show management level folks what was on the right sizing report. And the management person looks at this, knew anecdotally who the responsible party was for many of the workloads that should have been, I think it was compute that needed to be terminated, picks up the phone and calls the person into the room and says, why haven't you done this? And I mean, you've never seen somebody more blindsided, become more defensive, more dug in. There was no retrieving that situation from that moment on, because understandably, that person, it's just human nature, feels attacked, they feel accused, and they're going to find every reason under the sun why the report's wrong, why they really need that stuff. Absolutely picture book, worst thing you can do. So you're not going to get action doing that. You're going to get defensiveness, right? So what you want to do instead of that is you've built a relationship, you have a degree of trust, and now what you want to do is, when the tooling has recommendations, let's say it says there's a bunch of abandoned storage volumes, or let's say there's a bunch of compute that's idle. When you approach that RP, the way you're going to approach them interpersonally is you're going to say, the tooling can't talk to humans. The tooling looks only at certain performance metrics, and it's saying that these compute instances are idle. Can you help us understand if that's true, or if there are some of these that can be deleted? So you're asking a question, not making a statement. The statement in the earlier one was, this should have been done. You didn't do it. Not good. Here you're asking a question and you use language like, can you help us understand? Is there a reason? And you just watch people. They're not defensive. They're much more receptive to thinking about, well, maybe these can. And a lot of times there are very good reasons why the tooling would say something and not be correct. So I've had situations where we look for abandoned block storage volumes. In this context, this happened with AWS, so it was EBS volumes. And you go to the technical team and you say, hey, here's a whole bunch of unattached storage. and they say, good Lord, don't delete that. That's part of an auto scaling group. If you delete that, we're going to spawn workloads and they won't find their associated storage. So right there, if you had come to them and said, this stuff should be deleted, your credibility is going to go down the tubes. If you come to them and say, can you help us understand why it's there? Yes, it's auto scaling. And in that case, we did find some volumes that weren't auto scaling and we did delete them. But had you come to them with the wrong interpersonal dynamic, forget it. They would have just dug in and said, go away. So that's the other thing is the posture. So now we have composition of the team, make sure engineering is represented. The second thing is how you position the FinOps team. They're a resource to help. They're there to be a resource for the other teams. And yes, they're going to come and sometimes ask questions. And the third is, what is your interpersonal posture when you approach engineering? You built the relationship and you come to them with questions and not orders. The third and final thing is a little bit more nuanced, and that is how you report to find waste matters a great deal. So concretely, it begins all the way where I started with, is the FinOps team has segmented the spend and has named responsible parties. That's really important because what you want to do is approach each RP with only their resources. If you let me give a counterexample of the wrong way to do it. True story, had a large enterprise in the food space, and they were starting a FinOps initiative. I was helping them set up their FinOps org, and they installed some tooling. They installed actually Cloudability, and they pulled up the right size report pretty early on. And what they did was they basically, I think they exported the right size report. It was like compute right sizing, and to like a CSV or something like that. And they blast emailed it to all the engineers and said, find your stuff in this report and do what it says. Absolutely the worst thing you could possibly do. First of all, everybody's going to throw that email in the bin immediately because they do not have time to sort through 1,000 recommendations. And by the way, a lot of times the tooling is going to take a very literal interpretation of something like right sizing. So for example, it might name 50 or 100 VMs, or, compute instances where you could save 50 cents if you change the type. Not working. Those engineers are going to be like, this is just not worth it. It's not the tooling's fault, it's the way it's designed. But the point there is that when you don't segment it and send people only their stuff, you're not going to get any buy-in. So the second thing is that idea of how much juice is there in the squeeze, right? So you're going to bring the RPs only their equipment. And the next thing I would counsel people is make sure that the first thing you lead with when you bring them right sizing is where are the most dollars of savings for the least effort. So you don't want to send them 100 or 150 VMs that if changed from, whatever, an M4 to an M5, you save 50 cents. It's just going to irritate them. What you want to do is say, here's a lot of dollars on offer for very little effort. And then again, your posture is, do you think we can action?
What do you think a FinOps practitioner who's, let's say, going into a very immature organization in terms of FinOps,
Yep.
Maybe they have a pretty lousy account structure right now that's sort of grown up in a haphazard way. Maybe they have miscellaneous tags that don't coincide with any coherent strategy. So maybe they're confused about actually who owns what, or perhaps they have some big accounts that have multiple tenants in them. So the ownership question is unclear. And so it might be difficult to find the responsible people or nominate anyone responsible. And maybe the job then is a pretty arduous one of identifying who owns which accounts, who owns which resources, maybe changing the account hierarchy, maybe changing the tagging strategy. And they would seem to be examples where a fair amount of work needs to be put in without any clear reward, immediate reward. Does that require a different approach, do you think?
At all costs, that problem must be solved before you can do anything else. I have absolutely had that happen. I'm writing an article right now, which is actually has to do with architecting workloads. But in the article, I tell a case story that I experienced where I had a client where in the opening meetings before we even had actually engaged formally. We were kind of more in the sales cycle with them, and we sit down and we talk about where they are with setting up FinOps, with managing their spend. And they said to me in that early meeting, it was a large enterprise, by the way. They were spending 25 million a year. We have 25 AWS accounts. 80% of the spend is in 2 of them, and we have no idea what's going on in those 2 accounts. Full stop. We're not going to get anything else done FinOps wise until we solve that problem. And so a lot of the next 4 or 5 months I was engaged with them, we were sorting that problem. And what you have to do in that case, it absolutely at all costs must be remediated, because never mind right sizing. I mean, you're way past right sizing at that point. You're driving with no headlights on, and the probability of there being just enormous waste is very, very high, because your technical teams literally don't know what they're doing, and you don't know what they're doing. So the way you need to resolve that issue is you need to have a bunch of meetings and find out what set of if-then rules, for example, can be applied that will allow you to remediate that scenario. So concretely, within those 2 accounts, maybe there are tag values in there that we could use a relational database and set up a rule like this. If tag value contains blah, then RP is John. And you just need to meet with humans to figure out, how are we going to figure out who owns what in those accounts? Use a relational database to actually start to be able to report against it, and basically try to cover as many dollars as you can with RPs. And then you need to remediate. Then you need to move things into an account structure that makes sense, or you need to improve your tagging. But I think my answer to your question is that problem absolutely must be solved, period, full stop. There's no getting around it. You're not going to get any traction on any of this if you don't remediate that.
And what about maybe at the other end of the maturity scale? Would you see perhaps the ideal scenario being technical teams who take it upon themselves to identify cost efficiency initiatives, waste reduction initiatives, who maybe don't even need a FinOps team coming to them and saying, why don't you look at this? Why don't you look at that? Because they're so bought into their ownership and their responsibility for delivering value that they want to go looking for this stuff. Is that something you think is the end point?
I have seen pockets of that so far doing this work over the last 5 years, and it's really, really a beautiful thing when you see it. I'm incredibly fortunate right now because on my team, I have a consultant who is that way. So for example, we do a lot of BigQuery work for our clients, and just out of personal interest, he looked at some queries that I had written in BigQuery that were really pretty darn inefficient, and he refactored them. And now our costs weren't that high anyway. We're spending I think I was spending $15 to go fetch a customer or something like that on BigQuery. BigQuery charges based on how much data you scan. And he cut that to like 50 cents or something just by making the query much more efficient. So it's delightful when you see it. I have seen that at times where you just have self-actualized engineers that love this stuff, and they come to you proudly and say, I did X, Y, and Z, and I saved. To answer your question in the larger scale, I believe that's where all of this is headed. I believe that FinOps as a separate standalone discipline has a finite lifespan to the better. Because I think that what's actually happening is in cloud computing, there's actually nothing really new about how we do costing, about how we do budgeting. In manufacturing, we've had to allocate direct costs and indirect costs since the 1980s. And in the 1980s is really where activity-based management came into vogue. They started unit costing, and they really developed a great science of saying, here are the direct costs per unit of production, and here's how we're going to allocate the indirect costs. And then they started managing by the activities that were generating cost. There's absolutely nothing fundamentally different about cloud computing. We will get there. What happened in our case was that you had technical people who did not have any of that perspective. So they understood the cloud computing part. And then you had finance people who didn't understand cloud computing because there hadn't been decades of working with manufacturing where they already knew that. So you had two actors involved in this that didn't really understand each other. And what's happened is FinOps developed as a discipline to bridge that gap. That's where we are today. And I think that what's going to happen is we're going to get better. The enterprises will get better and better at the ordinary blocking and tackling of FinOps. And at some point, we're going to figure out it's going to be much more efficient if we have the engineers take this role on themselves. And that day will come. And I think the way it's going to come is via incentives. I think at some point, what's going to need to happen is engineering will have to start getting measured on things like gross profit, gross margins, unit costs. The instant they are measured on that, they will become the greatest FinOps experts anywhere. Because what the literature shows us, the academic literature shows us, is that human beings will, without fail, do exactly what an incentive compensation program rewards. It's the most amazing thing. I've seen that, especially with salespeople. You can come up. I've worked in a lot of different orgs in my career, and when you work near salespeople, a lot of times the way their compensation is structured can be fairly complicated. And sometimes I've seen orgs where they change it. They're going to say, well, now you're going to get kind of this much commission for this type of offering. And it's such an amazing thing to me that when those new compensation packages are announced, the very next day, the salespeople that I'm friendly with become PhDs in exactly how to maximize those commission packages. And so the same thing will happen the day that you change the way engineers are compensated, and you say efficiency is going to be a big part of it. They will become the leading FinOps PhDs overnight. That's what the literature says happens, and it's what I've seen happen on the ground. So I think it's a very good question you ask, and I think that's how it's going to happen. It's just going to take us probably 5 or 10 more years. And I think that FinOps will then have served its purpose as an independent discipline, and it'll melt into the technical teams at some point.
Do you think taking that idea of a sort of journey from zero maturity, where engineers are purely focused on the technical performance elements of cloud, through to the end point, the ideal end point, where they're focused on business value and they've synthesized the performance and cost stuff into an overall view that says, I'm here to deliver business value. And it's a combination of those things. So if we look at that entire journey, and at some point an organization starts to recognize this and incentivize the behaviors they want, do you think, because I've read this in a number of places, do you think one way of starting that process is to use gamification tactics, where it's sort of like incentives, it's making a game of it, it's sort of celebrating performance successes, it's giving engineers a challenge and some sort of publicity for how they do with it? Do you see that as a valid tactic?
I've seen it done, and I think my answer is it depends very much on the culture of the organization, how that's going to be perceived. It depends very much on whether it's a reward, is it the stick or the carrot? So where I've seen it work well is where you have a culture that already is sort of amenable to that type of thing. There are already other programs that exist, and you use the carrot approach, right? So you basically say, who are the leaders? Here's an example of what I've seen work. Here are the leaders who found the highest percentage cost takeout, last month. And then it's kind of like, whoo, where I think it could go sour is if you're in an organization that's really not, I don't want to say the morale isn't good, but we have all seen a lot of different cultures in our careers, and there are some cultures where there is, frankly, just a little bit more of a negative vibe in general. So maybe things aren't really running particularly well. Maybe there's anxiety around this topic of cloud costs to begin with. And I think then if you tried gamification, even unintentionally, it could be perceived as a shaming thing. And in that case, I would tread very, very carefully with this.
Or a gimmick, maybe.
Yeah. Again, it just really depends on the culture, whether they see that type of thing as enjoyable and fun already, and it's just another version of it. But if the culture, yeah, you're right. If it's seen as a gimmick, so whoever's doing that has to have a lot of trust and credibility of the actors in order to pull that off and make it work well. So I think each org needs to come to that and really understand how they're operating. I had one culture that worked really well. It was actually a UK grocery chain where it worked very well in my Cloudability days. and there was just a nice, fun culture there to begin with, right? So it worked out well. And then, but I'm thinking about, for example, a large food company that I was working with, where there was just a lot of chaos. It was an Azure, heavy Azure user, and they had really the segmentation question you asked earlier. They had terrible problems segmenting spend and charging back. And the reason it's a little bit technical, but the reason they did was how they had come up with the naming conventions for resource groups, versus subscriptions. So Azure logically groups their spending as subscriptions, and then within that you have logical groupings called resource groups. And unfortunately, they use the same key value pair names for those, and it raised a lot of hell because you didn't know which one to apply in which situation. And so management weren't getting the reporting they needed, technical teams weren't getting the report they were needed, and there was a lot of pressure because everywhere else in the org could report correctly and the cloud computing couldn't. So their morale was really poor. There was a lot of negativity, and I would have steered clear of gamification in that situation, because there was an immediate perception of negativity, I think, in a lot of contexts. And so if you tried it there, it probably would have been very poorly received, if that makes sense.
Rich, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I'll incorporate this after I've edited it into a file and send you a view of it, and then hopefully it can help us with reducing waste and getting engineering action. So thanks for that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Cheers, Rich.
Bye.
Bye now.